So, hello everyone. Sorry, just making grace there. Hi everyone. Most of you are here, but if you do decide to watch this back. So today we are looking at lecture four. I can't believe it's lecture four already. And today we're going to be looking at identity and bias in teachers and students. Um, so last week was a guest lecture with Melissa Lynch on the need for the 10th ground. And unfortunately, as I sent you an email, I hope you got it. We weren't able to record it for various reasons, but I can go through it with you, and you have the slides as well. But I can do that at the end of today's session. So today, I think everyone's here. Today, we're going to look at defining bias. We're going to look at different types of bias. I'm going to look at ecological system theories of Bronfenbrenner and Epstein, and I know you've looked at them before in different modules, but we're going to look at them in terms of teacher bias and student bias and how the interplays of those ecological system theories feed into different types of bias. Okay, everyone happy with that? Hi, Grace, nice to see you. You didn't miss anything. So, defining bias. So bias is very natural. Everyone has biases. We all have them, and they can be against an idea, against an object, against a group, or against an individual. I have a huge bias against orange sweets. Absolutely hate them. If you give me a packet of Skittles, I will pick out every single orange one, usually give them to my dogs. I'll eat all the rest, but I cannot eat orange sweets. It's just a bias. I just don't like them. I've never tasted them. They might be lovely. Some people have them against vegetables like sprouts. Some people just like, nope, won't eat them. That's just a bias. It doesn't cause anyone any issues, but we all have them. So it can be a learned behavior. But the more negative biases are dependent on variables like a person's socioeconomic status, things like race and ethnicity, and educational background, and those kind of things. And when the biases are dependent on those areas, that's when they can be problematic, especially in an educational context. In the individual level, on a one-to-one level, bias can impact someone's personal and professional relationships. And then moving up to a societal level, it can lead to unfair persecution of a group, for example, things like slavery. Gosh, I can't think of any other examples off the top of my head, but slavery is a very good sorry, I can't I don't know what's happened to me just there. It's a good example of bias at societal level. But at an educational level, bias can hugely affect how educators interact with their students. And educators, like all of us, have their own personal biases, but without meaning to, those biases will affect how you interact with your students and vice versa. Students' biases will affect how they interact with their educators. And we're going to look at all of those today. So, what is a bias?
So, Sinead, could I ask a question? Would
Yeah.
all biases not be learned? Because something, for example, with you with the orange sweets,
Mm.
that's. I suppose there's like there's obviously a difference between kind of taste and bias. Like, obviously, if you don't like blue jeans or you don't, things like that, nobody's really worried about it. That's kind of taste. Bias, obviously, is something that would seem to have a kind of negative connotations. But generally, would it not be accepted that we would always learn those biases, whether within the family or within society or something like that? You wouldn't, generally be born with them. I don't know, or is that a whole sociological question that's too deep to get into?
Oh, it's an interesting question because the word bias tends to have these quite negative connotations. But biases, and you can see on the slide I've just changed it to, can actually be both positive and negative. You can have positive biases, and a lot of us have both, but we all focus very heavily on the negatives because it's the negative ones that tend to affect people the most, and those negative kind of predispositions to certain things. But I think you're right in that they are learned behaviors, both whether they're positive or they're negative. And there is a difference between, as you said, the taste and particular biases, but they probably are learned behaviors and they've come from from within somewhere. Like I probably got my I hate orange Skittles from seeing a parent or someone else that I look up to refusing to eat them, because I know my daughter actually refuses to eat orange sweets now too. So she's picked that up because I won't do it. So she also now won't do it either. So, but you're right. They are learned behaviors because babies aren't born with biases. So it's an environmental and social thing. Anyone else? Are we happy? Does anyone else want to respond to Kevin's point? Sorry, let's see the chat. Nicole, cognitive bias. You're always ahead of me, Nicole. We're going to come to that in a little while. Okay, so their biases can be positive or negative. Not your bad at all, don't worry. The biases, as I said, are very natural. We all have them, and they can be conscious versus unconscious. And there's a difference between unconscious and subconscious. So the main type of biases are conscious, which is that kind of explicit, we know that we have those. Then the implicit or unconscious biases. And then, as Nicole mentioned, the cognitive, and there's others like prejudicial and contextual. So I'm just going to take a drink because my mouth is a bit dry. Okay, so starting with explicit biases, and I've just chosen this example here of the 11th night bonfire, because this is a very common example that we see every year in Ireland of a conscious bias. So a conscious bias is when the people who are acting biased are aware that they have this bias. They're doing it on purpose, and they know that it's harmful and that it causes problems to another population. And they're acting with intent. So they're quite explicit in their beliefs. People with a conscious bias are very explicit in their beliefs. They know what they want from those beliefs, and they behave with a very clear intention. So that's very conscious, and it can consist of verbal or physical harassment or exclusion. So, with these 11th night bonfires, they will put up Irish flags or political posters and so on, and they will burn them. And that's a very explicit bias against the Republic of Ireland or the Catholics, or however they kind of want to frame that. And that conscious bias can really manifest as very exclusionary behavior, a very us and them type of biases. So it's very prejudicial, it's very discriminatory against people, and there's usually a malicious intent behind a conscious bias. But they know it's happening and they know they're doing it, which I think is an important point to this. Okay. The second one, which is slightly different or maybe slightly harder for people to recognize, is the unconscious or implicit type of biases. So you probably know that there's a difference between unconscious and subconscious. So subconscious is, for example, I know where my car is. I know I parked my car, but I'm not thinking about it at the moment. Well, I am now. But that's subconscious. That's something that is held in my brain. I'm aware of it. I know it's there, but I'm just not thinking about it. Unconscious is things I don't know are in my brain. I don't know I'm thinking about. I don't know that I possess this information. So an unconscious bias is something you don't know, you don't think about, and you're unaware that you have those theories in you. Does that make sense? Yeah? All good. Okay. So most people aren't aware of this at all, but I think you've probably come across before. We have a predisposition to gravitate to people that are very similar to us. And that's called, in psychology, it's called in-group and out-group theories. It's social psychology, but it's basically I like people who are like me versus I don't like people who aren't like me. And we do that because we as humans have a need to belong to social groups, to create our own social identities. And when we were all cave people living in the caves, that's how we survived. When we lived with people who were like us, who looked like us, who had the same, wanted to chase the same animals for their dinner as us, who built the bonfires the same way, who did everything the same way, we stayed in these little groups. And Any other groups, we were like, no, stay away from me. You are weird. You build your bonfires differently. Whatever the reason was, they were the other group, and we didn't let them in. And that's we protected ourselves. And like most evolutionary practices, it takes a long time for people to move out of that. So that's where that kind of implicit and unconscious bias, and as Nicole mentioned, it's a cognitive bias, comes from. That it's a survival instinct, a social instinct, a need to belong that we create. I'm more like this person, therefore I'm safest with this group of people. And it's very normal, it's very natural, it's not something to be ashamed of. However, from an educator perspective, it's something that we do need to be aware of. So, Nicole, cognitive biases. Well done, you're ahead of me. There's a good few different cognitive biases. I think there's like 125. I just picked the most kind of commonly known ones, the most well-known ones, and what I think would probably be of most interest. So the repeated errors of thinking that occur when you misinterpret information around you. So basically, our brains work that when we get information, we put it into little boxes. And that allows us to make quick decisions and move on with our lives instead of having to spend ages thinking things through. And they're called schemas. I don't know if you already know that. But cognitive biases are when we make the wrong decision and we put things into the wrong box because our brain is going down the wrong path. So these are really, really common types of cognitive bias. So, for example, the actor-observer bias is the difference in how we see our own behavior versus how we see other people's. And this is really, really common when the outcome is negative. So when there's a negative outcome, people tend to attribute their own behaviors to external forces, but other people's behaviors to their personality. So they swap it around. The anchoring bias. So anchoring bias is when the first piece of information holds the most weight. So you might be told something by one person and then told something by a second person, and your brain is more likely to believe the first piece of information you've heard, which can be difficult if the first piece of information wasn't the truth. And the only way to really counteract that is to go and read about it and find out the truth as and when you can. Attentional bias relates to paying attention to some things while simultaneously ignoring other things. And that can be really helpful when you're focusing on really important piece of information, but it can cause you to disregard other things that are also important because you're biased and you're only focusing on these things make sense to me. Availability heuristic. So our brains, you may know this, are a little bit like a forest. And the paths that we access to ideas the most often, those paths are really well trodden, they're really clear, they're really well lit, they're very easy to get to. And those are the ideas and the thoughts and the memories that we access regularly. Whereas over here, this is a really deep, dark forest with the ideas and memories we don't really bother with very much. So these ones over here that are more available to us, easier to get to, we're more likely to trust these because we've accessed them more often, we use them more often. Whereas the ones that we access less often may be more trustworthy, but because we don't bother with them as much, we are biased against them, even though they're all held in our own brain. Confirmation bias. I think we've all heard about this quite a lot in the media recently. It's been mentioned quite a bit. It's when you focus on ideas that support your current biases with the exclusion of other information. Dunning-Kruger, very common on social media. And I think we've all come across people like this. Dunning-Kruger is when someone knows a little bit about something but thinks they know a lot. And the Dunning-Kruger graph actually shows people who know a little and how much they think they know goes up, whereas people who know a lot and how much they think they know goes down. It's almost the opposite. False consensus is very common in large groups. It's when people overestimate how much someone agrees with or approves of their behavior, just because sometimes people won't stand up and say, I disagree with you. I was actually reading RT News just before I came along here, and there was a really interesting thing that kind of feeds into this is that Robert F. Kennedy has been put forward to be the health secretary or something, but basically everyone is supporting him in whatever thing that's going on at the moment, even though they were disagreeing with him before. But the reason they're supporting him is because they're worried about their own places. So that's similar to that false consensus, because he will have this idea, well, actually, all these people agree and approve of my behavior, but what they're actually doing is just protecting themselves. So he will be overestimating it because people aren't standing up and saying, I disagree with you. And self-serving bias is seen a lot in universities and colleges, where we attribute good things to us and bad things are other people's fault. So I got good grades because I worked really hard and I deserved them. But when I got a bad grade, that's because my lecturer is rubbish and marked me really badly. So, any thoughts on those? Okay. Perfect. Oh, sorry. No. Shh. Sorry. Okay, so I wanted to show you this. This is an example of attentional bias. Have you seen it before? Hang on.
With Survey Monkey.
Sorry, one second.
This is a test of selective attention.
Yeah, do you recognize this? Can you hear this? Is the sound coming up for you? Okay.
Gorillas thing.
Count how many times the...
Can you hear that? Yes. Okay, perfect. So I will press play on that. Thanks, Nicole. I'll press play on that for you now.
Players wearing white pass the basketball.
How many passes?
I got 13, but I think I missed a couple at the beginning.
Okay.
I got
How many
15.
passes did you count? The correct
15.
answer is 15 passes.
Well done.
But did you see the gorilla?
Did anyone see the gorilla?
Yes.
No.
You did? Who
Yeah,
saw
I
the
was
gorilla?
spotted. Yes, I've seen it.
You did? Okay, perfect.
This video...
Right, so, sorry, that kept pausing there. Okay, so that is an example of situational bias or bias. So basically, it's really interesting that a few of you, I didn't see how many, but a good few of you saw the gorilla. Would you actually maybe just pop it in the chat if you saw the gorilla, just like a yes, if you saw it, because I'd be interested to know how many of you do. Because generally, only, let's have a look, 1, 2, 3. Perfect. It's very rare that people actually see the gorilla, because the point they're making is, well done everyone who did, and don't worry if you didn't, because most people don't. The point they're making is when you focus very heavily on one thing, you're not looking around you. And it's really important for things like driving, because drivers are focused here, but they tend to miss things that are going on over here. It's also a huge problem with airplane pilots, that they're missing things. And in relation to education, the point is that when you're kind of looking over here, do you know what's happening over here? And it's very interesting that so many of you actually saw it, because it's very uncommon to see it. Actually, I was reading some research that was done by the same people, and what they did was they got the, I think they're called radiographers, the people who look at MRIs, and they were looking at, thanks, John, that's what they're called. They were looking at MRIs of brains, and these people look at MRIs of the brain to look for, I think it's cancer nodules or something they're called. And what these two guys did was they went to these MRIs, and they did a few hundred of them, and they put in little teeny tiny gorillas into the MRIs. And then they gave them back to, and the participants didn't know that this was happening. They were just given the MRIs as normal. And there was a really high percentage, like 80 or 90%, I think it was 80, didn't see the gorilla, which says an awful lot about your attention. Now, importantly, they all saw what they were looking for. So on the scans that did have the cancer or the thing they were meant to be looking for, they all saw it. But the point of the exercise was when there was another thing there, so many of them missed it, like 80 whatever percent missed it, which has really shown that there is this attentional bias. When you're looking at or looking for one specific thing, you miss an awful lot else. The closer you look, the less you see. That's a very good way of putting it, Nicole. Yeah.
Video is from...
Okay, so ecological systems series. So they're one of the most recent attempts to understand and guide the response to developmental issues. Sorry, I'm just having a drink. And they look at the interaction between social environments and development. So there is two main theorists, which are Epstein and Brenner, and they consider the layers of influence on the child, which is family, social, community, cultural, environmental, and so on. And you know a lot of this already. So I'm just going to go over it again, just in case you've kind of forgotten a little bit since the last time you looked at them. So the first one, this is Brenner's. So there is a few different layers to it. So each layer is, so the microsystem is the first layer. So that's the direct influence on the child. So the friends, the family, the teachers, the doctors, so on and so on. And these are the layers. So these are layers of influence on the child. So the biases that the people in this microsystem have, they are the people whose biases have the direct influence on the child. So if there's a lot of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a bias, maybe about healthcare or something within that, those are the biases that the child's hearing a lot about. And children are very susceptible to that kind of thing. Then the mesosystem is the relationships between them. So how the communication between them exists to connect the different types of supports. The exosystem is, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. The exosystem is the next one up. So that is the indirect influences on the child, such as things like school boards, government agencies, but also things like the parents' employment status, and change of teachers, those kind of things that the child has no actual direct influence with or doesn't directly interact with, but it does influence them, it does affect them. And then you have the next one, which is the macro system. So that's the broad overarching structure with cultural and political values. Now, I said this in my lecture this morning, and they all looked at me with a big blank stare, most of them, so I hope you lot know. Do you remember when they changed the maths? Anyone here remember when they changed maths? Because do you remember that? Yes, Nicole remembers. Okay, well, in today's class, they all insisted that they've never heard of a change of maths, so that's how young they are. But a few years ago, the maths was changed. It could be a 10, 20. Sorry, I just got a message saying that my meeting time is running out, even though I have a DCU account. That is strange. Okay, if it cuts off, could we just come back to this meeting? Yeah, okay. So if you remember that they changed the maths, so basically people were taught maths one way, and then a new way of being taught maths was brought in. So that had an effect on children, on their learning experience. Maybe a more recent experience would be the changes to the Leaving Cert that are being brought in now. So, of course, for people who are going to be teaching in secondary schools or even in further education, the knowledge you've learned or you learned as an educator when you were in secondary school yourself is going to be completely different because they'll have come through a completely different model of education. Another example of the macro system and the effect it can have, those cultural and political issues, is you've probably heard that Trump and his government in the US are getting rid of all gay and LGBT science-related things. And the CRC has actually sent out information saying that their researchers now have to pull all their papers that mention anything about gender or LGBT, which is removing academic freedom. So what's the effect? There's a knock-on effect of that on biases, because when you remove that from science, from academics, then there is a knock-on effect that it's like we can no longer talk about these things, and that creates a bias, which of course then goes down and affects children. Okay, and then the final one is the Corona system, which is the life experiences people have over their lifetime, their life changes, divorce, getting married, environmental, historical events, and so on. So, did anyone, or have you considered what is missing from that in terms of things that affect children or young adults, especially young adults? Because I think that original one is very much aimed at children. But what about if it's young adults?
Would it be hormones or like their physical changes, or would that be in the chrono system?
That's more in the chrono system, but Nicole actually has the internet. What about? But it was a good one there, Kevin. But more kind of recent is the internet and social media. So this Paul Eaton, I think is his name, he actually updated Brenner's model to consider the influence of social media. And when you're looking at that older age group, like young adults or secondary school children, it's really important to look at the influences of social media, because whereas in the Bronfenbrenner model, all the influences were coming from like parents, peers, people they're seeing face to face, teachers. When you kind of think about where they're getting all their influences from and remembering that their influences are affecting their biases, you have to consider that they're hearing things on Twitter, on Facebook, on TikTok, on all these places, and those directly influence them, and those directly influence their biases. And that's the macro systems and their mesosystems. But then when you widen that out to the exosystems of who makes those kind of overarching decisions, it's no longer people like the school boards and government agencies who have these huge decisions. And even though they are still making those decisions, people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, who of course don't know any of us exist, they're deciding how and when we can use things like Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp. And who has access to that information, who can read your text messages or the students' text messages to each other. And that all has a huge effect. And when they're reading the things that are being said by these people who are very influential and have this influence over their lives, they're reading this information that's being said. And that's something that really needs to be considered when you're talking about the bias that's being brought into their lives. Okay, so has anyone any thoughts on Bronfenbrenner or even this updated model? You're probably all tired after your day, are you? So the second one, and I'm not going to spend too long on this because it's very similar. So the second one is Epstein's, and she looked at the overlapping spheres of influence So the main spheres, similar to Bronfenbrenner's small microsystems, are the school, the family, and the community. And then in the middle is the child, who is the center of everything. So all those influences affect how the child learns. So starting with the family experiences, their philosophy, their cultural and social practices are one type of experience. And then you have the community, their type of community connections, and again, those cultural and social practices, which is slightly bigger and more overarching, but they affect the child as well. And then you have the school, and there's the government of the school, and then within that, the teaching and the practices of the teacher. So all of those affect the child. So this is going to cut off in a minute, and I'll have to contact DCU tomorrow about that. So I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of an activity. So individually, if you could write down a few ways that you think social environments can affect teacher bias. And it's 7:35 now, so we'll say 7:40. And what we might do is, while you're doing that, I will close this and we could start a new Zoom then. Okay? So at 7:40, we'll pop back to the new Zoom, or we can pop back to it straight away. But does that make sense? Yeah, because otherwise it's going to cut off. So if you write that down for 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about it at 7:40.